The girl didn't scream when the wagon drove away. She didn't run after it. She didn't even cry. She just stood in the middle of the Montana Trail with one hand pressed flat against her chest, holding something underneath her dress, and watched the dust swallow the only home she'd ever known. She was 10 years old. It was August. The nearest town was 13 miles north. Caleb Harding almost didn't stop. He told himself it wasn't his business. He told himself a lot of things. Then she turned around and looked at him, and every single one of those things fell apart. If this story already has hold of your heart, subscribe to this channel right now, follow along to the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Caleb Harding had not spoken more than 40 words to another human being in 6 days, and he'd been fine with that. He rode his fence line every morning the same way he'd done for 11 years. Head down, eyes forward, moving through the world, like a man who had decided the world was better off without his full attention. That was the arrangement. He kept his land. He kept his cattle. He kept his silence. And the world, for the most part, kept its distance. He was 2 miles out from his south pasture when he saw her. A child, standing dead center in the middle of the trail, not moving, not looking in either direction. Just standing there in the full hammer of an August morning with her hand pressed flat to her chest, like she was trying to hold something in. He slowed his horse to a walk. She didn't move. He brought the horse to a stop 10 feet away and looked at her for a long moment. Red hair, brown eyes, a dress that had been washed too many times and had given up somewhere along the way. Bare feet on dry, cracked earth. No bag, no water, nothing. "You lost, miss," he said. She looked at him the way wild things look at you when they're deciding whether you're worth the energy of running. Careful, still, measuring every inch of him before she committed to anything. "No, sir," she said. "I ain't lost. You live nearby." "Not anymore." He looked past her down the trail in both directions. Nothing moved. No wagon, no horse, no adult standing anywhere within sight to account for a 10-year-old girl standing alone on a Montana trail in August heat with nothing but what she was wearing. "Where's your mama?" he asked. Something moved across her face so fast he almost missed it. "Don't have one," she said. "My daddy's gone too." He stepped down from his horse slowly, the way he moved around things that could still bolt if he came at them wrong. He stopped a few feet away and kept his voice easy. "How long you been standing here?" "Since yesterday evening." He went still. Yesterday evening. He looked at her feet, the cracked heels, the raw places where the skin had split and bled and dried and split again. He looked at her lips, dry and pale. He looked at her hand still pressed flat against her chest. "Somebody drop you off," he said. Her jaw moved once. "My stepmother stopped the wagon and told me to get out. She said she'd be back." She looked at him steadily. She wasn't. "Where were you coming from?" "Millhaven Station, southeast." Caleb knew Millhaven Station. He'd ridden through it 2 weeks ago. It was 13 miles south and 3 miles off the main road. "You walked 13 miles, he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." He pulled his canteen from the saddle and held it out. She took it without hesitation and drank the way people drink when thirst has moved past discomfort into something more serious. He let her drink until she'd had enough, then said quietly, "Easy now. Too fast'll make you sick." She stopped immediately, wiped her mouth on the back of her wrist, handed it back. "Thank you," she said. "What's your name?" "Nora." "Nora what?" She paused. "Nora Hale." "Hale." He turned that over once without showing anything on his face. "How old are you, Nora Hale?" 10. He put his boot in the stirrup and swung up. Then he held his hand down to her. "Come on," he said. "You ride." She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. The same measuring look she'd given him from the trail, careful and complete, running through some internal calculation he couldn't see and wasn't going to rush. Then she reached up and took it. Her grip was stronger than he expected. Maggie Ford had been cooking breakfast in Caleb Harding's kitchen for 4 years, and she had developed in that time a reliable understanding of what normal looked like in this house. Normal was quiet. Normal was one man, one cup of coffee, no conversation worth noting before the second cup. Normal was a house that ran like a clock because the man who lived in it had decided that a clock was the most honest thing a person could aspire to be. So when Caleb's horse came up the drive with an extra rider small, still sitting in front of him, like she weighed nothing and had nowhere else to be, Maggie put down the pan she was holding and walked to the door. She watched Caleb help the child down. Watched the girl land on her feet and stand in the yard and look at the house with an expression Maggie had seen before on people who had run out of options and were trying very hard not to let that show. Caleb said, "Maggie, this is Nora. She needs water, food, and somewhere to sit out of the heat." Maggie looked at the girl, the dress, the feet, the hand still pressed against her chest even now, even standing in a stranger's yard protecting something. "Of course," Maggie said. "Come inside, sweetheart." The girl looked at Caleb first. He gave a single nod. Only then did she follow Maggie through the door. In the kitchen, Maggie put cold water on the table and a plate of cornbread and sliced salt pork left from the morning. The girl sat down and ate slowly. Far too slowly for how hungry she clearly was. Like eating fast had taught her something unpleasant once, and she hadn't forgotten the lesson. Maggie sat across from her and said nothing. She'd raised 2 sons alone, and she knew the difference between a child who needed talking to and a child who needed to be given room to breathe. After a while, Nora said, "Your kitchen smells like my daddy's did." "What did your daddy's kitchen smell like?" "Coffee and pine resin." She looked at the window. "He always had pine boards drying in the back. He was going to build me a bookshelf." Maggie kept her voice flat and gentle. "Sounds like a good man." "He was the best man I knew." She said it plainly, the way children say things that are simply true and don't require decoration. "He died 14 months ago. I'm sorry, honey." Nora looked back at her food. "My stepmother said he fell from the barn roof, but he never went on the barn roof. He always said it wasn't worth the risk." She put her fork down for a moment. "I wrote it down. The things that didn't make sense. I wrote all of it down." Maggie looked at the hand still pressed to the girl's chest. "What have you got there?" she asked. Quiet. No pressure. Nora looked at her for a moment. Then she lifted her hand and showed the outline of something flat pressed against her ribs beneath the dress. "My notebook," she said. "I've had it since before he died. He gave it to me." "You've been carrying it this whole time?" "Yes, ma'am." She picked her fork back up. It's the only thing she didn't take. Caleb came in through the back door and hung his hat. He poured a glass of water and leaned against the counter and looked at Nora with the particular stillness of a man running calculations behind a neutral face. Maggie gave him a look over the girl's head, deliberate small, that stopped whatever he'd been about to say. He drank his water. "Nora," Maggie said after a moment, "is there family we should contact? Someone who'll be looking for you?" "My uncle," she said. "My daddy's brother, Abel Hale. He lives in Iowa. But my stepmother stopped the letters a long time ago. I don't think he knows my daddy is gone." She paused. "I don't think he even knows I exist anymore." Caleb set his glass down. "Your stepmother stopped the letters?" "Yes, sir. She stopped everything that came from outside." Nora looked at him. "She was afraid of what I might tell someone." "What were you afraid to tell?" Nora's hand went back to her chest. Back to the notebook. "Everything," she said. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Caleb looked at Maggie. Maggie looked at the girl. "You'll stay here tonight," Caleb said. "We'll sort the rest in the morning." Nora looked at him with those brown eyes that had been taking the measure of things since she'd first turned to face him on that trail. "I know," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "What?" "I know I can stay." She looked at her plate. "That's why I walked here." He turned and looked at her properly. "You walked 13 miles specifically to this ranch." "Yes, sir." "Why?" Nora set her fork down and folded her hands on the table with a steadiness that didn't belong to a 10-year-old. "Because my daddy used to talk about you," she said, "before he got sick. He said Caleb Harding was the only man in Harlan County who ever returned what wasn't his to keep." She looked up at him. "He said you found $300 of his in a saddlebag at a cattle auction and rode 2 days to bring it back." Caleb went still. "He said, you didn't even leave your name," Nora continued. "The auctioneer told him afterward. He said a tall rancher with a gray horse left it on the table and rode out before anyone could stop him." She looked at her hands. "He said a man who does something like that when nobody's watching is a man you can trust when everything's falling apart." The kitchen was very quiet. "Your father was Wesley Hale," Caleb said. "Yes, sir." He turned and walked to the window. His hands were still, but Maggie, who had known this man 4 years and read his silences like weather, saw the tension across the line of his shoulders and understood that something had just shifted in the room that was not going to shift back. "I knew your father," Caleb said. "Not well, but I knew him." He was quiet for a moment. "He was a good man." "Yes," Nora said. "He was." Caleb stayed at the window a moment longer. Then he said without turning around, "What's in the notebook, Nora?" She didn't answer right away. Maggie watched the girl's face move through something not fear exactly, more like the expression of a person who has been carrying something alone for so long that the act of setting it down feels almost more dangerous than keeping it. Then Nora reached into the neck of her dress and pulled out the notebook. Small battered, the cover worn soft with handling. She put it on the table. "It started as drawings," she said. "My daddy taught me a kind of picture writing when I was 7. He said it was so we could leave notes for each other that nobody else could read." Her voice was steady. "After he died, I used it to write down what I saw, what I heard, what didn't make sense." Caleb turned from the window and came to the table. He picked up the notebook and opened it. It was not what he expected. The pages were covered in a dense, careful system of symbols, not random, not childish, organized by date. Each entry had a sequence of marks, some like letters, some like small drawings, some like numbers rendered in a private code. But beside each one, in much smaller writing, a translation in plain English printed in a child's careful hand. Caleb read for a long time. Maggie came to look over his shoulder. August 14th. Dee met with man in black coat at the south fence after dark. Gave him something wrapped in cloth. He did not come to the front door. September 3rd. Dee burned papers from Daddy's desk. I saw the fire from my window. She said it was trash. It wasn't trash. I saw the edge of the deed before it caught. October 12th. Lawyer Vane came to the house. 3rd time. Daddy never met Lawyer Vane. Dee said he was handling the estate. She sent me outside. I stayed by the window. October 19th. I heard her tell Vane, "The girl is the only problem left." And Vane said, "Then we manage the girl." November 2nd. Dee told me Daddy fell from the barn roof, but Daddy's boots were clean. I checked them myself the night before he died. A man who fell from a roof wouldn't have clean boots. Caleb set the notebook down on the table. Very carefully, the way you set down something that has changed the nature of everything around it. He looked at Nora. "You've been keeping this since before your father died," he said. "Since 2 weeks before," she said. "I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know how wrong." "And Lawyer Vane," he said. "Silas Vane, out of Copper Falls." Nora's chin came up slightly. "You know him." "I know of him." Caleb pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Nora, this notebook, the things written in here. Do you understand what they mean?" "I understand what I saw and what I heard." She met his eyes. "I'm 10, Mr. Harding. I'm not stupid." "I never said you were." "No," she said. "You didn't." She looked at the notebook on the table between them. "My daddy used to say that the most dangerous thing in the world isn't a gun or a knife. It's a child who pays close attention." She paused. "He taught me to pay attention." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Your stepmother put you out on that trail and drove away. But she didn't do it in a panic. She didn't do it angry. She did it deliberately." He looked at her. "Do you know why now?" Nora folded her hands in her lap. "Because she found out the notebook was gone," she said. "I had to take it when I left because I'd been keeping it hidden in the barn, and 2 days ago she started searching the barn. I don't know how she knew, but she knew." Her voice didn't waver. "She figured I had it. She figured I'd run. And she put me out on that road so that when she comes looking, I'm a runaway. A troubled girl, not a witness." The word witness landed in the kitchen like a stone dropped in still water. Maggie sat down slowly. Caleb looked at the notebook. He looked at this girl 10 years old, red hair, brown eyes that had seen too much and kept seeing anyway, and he thought about Wesley Hale returning $300 that most men would have kept without a second thought. He thought about what kind of man raises a daughter like this. He thought about what kind of woman puts that daughter on a trail alone in August and calls it a solution. "She'll come looking," Maggie said quietly. "Probably already has someone asking around." "I know," Nora said. "Lawyer Vane will file something. She'll use the law." She said it with the flat certainty of someone who has thought this through more times than they should have had to. "She has money, and she has connections, and she knows how to make me sound like a problem instead of a person." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "You thought all that out?" "I had 13 miles to think," she said. "And 14 months before that." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Steady, certain. The way he'd shaken hands with Wesley Hale at that cattle auction, and meant every word of it without saying a single one. "You're not going back to her," he said. Nora looked at his hand on hers. Her throat moved once. Her jaw set hard. "Mr. Harding," she said quietly, "she'll make it very difficult for you. Your land, your... Nora." His voice was quiet and final, and had no room in it for argument. "You're not going back." She stared at him. Something in her face shifted. Not tears, not relief. Something older and more complicated than either. The look of a person who has been holding a door closed for so long that when someone finally holds it open, the first instinct is to check whether it's a trap. She turned her hand over slowly beneath his, and she held on. That night, Maggie sat beside Nora's bed until the girl fell asleep. She did not fall asleep easily. She sat against the headboard with her back to the wall and the notebook pressed to her chest, and her eyes moving to the door every time the house made a sound. "Nobody's coming in here tonight," Maggie said. "I know." Nora's voice was careful. "I just don't sleep any other way anymore." Maggie looked at her. "How long?" "Since my daddy got sick." She pulled her knees up. "She used to come in at night sometimes, not to check on me, just to stand in the doorway." Her voice was matter-of-fact, flat. The tone of someone who has processed something so many times, it has stopped hurting in the sharp way. "I learned it was better to be awake." Maggie said nothing. She sat in the chair and she did not move, and she let the silence say what words would have gotten wrong. After a while, Nora said, "Maggie." "Yes." "Do you believe me, not Mr. Harding? You." Maggie looked at her. This girl with her red hair and her worn-out dress and her notebook of symbols and her terrible, careful logic about the way the world worked and who in it could be trusted with the truth. "Every word," Maggie said. Every single word. Nora lay down. Not sitting up this time, lying flat, arms at her sides, staring at the ceiling with the focused concentration of someone practicing something. Practicing what it felt like to be still, without waiting for something to go wrong. Maggie sat with her until the breathing evened out. Then she walked out to the porch where Caleb was standing in the dark with his hands on the porch rail and his eyes on the south road. "She's asleep," Maggie said. "Good." Caleb. She stood beside him. Silas Vane. "I know. He's got Judge Pryor in his pocket. Every man in this county knows it, even if nobody says it." "I know that too." Caleb's jaw worked once. "Wesley Hale is buried 14 months and nobody asked a single hard question about how he died. His land went to his widow inside 3 weeks. His brother in Iowa doesn't know he's dead." He turned and looked at Maggie. "And a 10-year-old girl spent 14 months alone in that house writing down everything she saw in a code her father taught her, because it was the only way to keep the truth from being taken." Maggie looked out at the dark land. Something moved far south on the road, slow and deliberate in the moonlight. A dust trail. She pointed without speaking. Caleb saw it. He watched it for a moment. Then he walked inside, and when he came back he was holding his rifle. Not raised. Just present. The way a man holds a thing that might be needed and doesn't intend to be caught without it. "That child trusts you with everything she has," Maggie said quietly. "I know. Wesley Hale trusted you with her before he was gone. He just didn't know that's what he was doing when he told her about you." Caleb looked at the dust trail moving north. "She walked 13 miles barefoot in August to find a man she'd never met based on something her dead father told her," Maggie said. "On nothing but his word and her own nerve." She shook her head once. "That's not a child asking for help, Caleb. That's a child making a decision. She chose you the same way your father chose land because she believed it would hold." He didn't answer right away. The dust trail had stopped at the far edge of his south fence line. 2 shapes in the moonlight, watching. "Go back inside," he said. "Check on her." Maggie went. She paused in the doorway. "Caleb, whatever comes through that gate tonight or tomorrow or the day after, don't let it take her. She's already lost enough." "She won't lose anything else," he said. "Not on my land." He said it the way Wesley Hale had once told Maggie that Caleb Harding said things without theater, without performance, with the particular weight of a man who had never once in his life made a promise he didn't keep and wasn't about to start. The 2 shapes at the fence line sat their horses a long time. Caleb Harding stood on his porch with his rifle and didn't move. After a while, the shapes turned and rode south. He stayed on the porch long after they were gone, listening to the land settle and breathe in the August dark, thinking about Wesley Hale and what a good man leaves behind when the world takes him too soon. Thinking about a notebook full of careful symbols. Thinking about a girl who had pressed her hand flat to her chest for 13 miles to keep the truth safe inside it. Some things cannot be taken if someone decides they cannot be taken. He had decided. Word reached Harlan Creek by noon the next day. The way word always reached small towns, not by telegraph, not by newspaper, but by the particular speed of human curiosity, moving mouth to mouth, until it arrived somewhere distorted and twice as loud as the truth it started from. Caleb Harding had taken in a stray child. Caleb Harding had found a runaway girl on the South Trail. Caleb Harding, who hadn't sat through a full Sunday service in 4 years, and who returned greetings with a nod and nothing more, had apparently gone soft enough to bring home a red-haired girl nobody could account for. By the time Caleb rode into town for supplies that afternoon, 3 separate people had already formed opinions about the situation and were prepared to share them. The first was Pete Dunbar at the dry goods store, who leaned on his counter and said, with the grin of a man who found other people's complications amusing, "Heard you picked up some trouble on the South Trail." Caleb looked at him. "I need flour salt and a spool of black thread." Pete got the order together without further comment. The second was Reverend Aldis's wife, Clara, who touched Caleb's arm outside the post office with a soft expression that managed to be both sympathetic and proprietary at the same time. "It was a kind thing you did, Mr. Harding. We're all praying the matter resolves itself quickly and the child is returned to her proper home." Caleb tipped his hat. "Appreciate that, ma'am." The third was Sheriff Frank Beaumont, who waited until Clara Aldis had moved off and then fell into step beside Caleb on the boardwalk with the unhurried movement of a man who had something to say and had been thinking about how to say it since before sunrise. "You know what you've walked into," Frank said. It wasn't a question. "I know a 10-year-old girl was left on the South Trail in August heat," Caleb said. "I know she walked 13 miles on bare feet to get off it. I know that too." Frank kept his voice low. "I also know that Dorothea Crane sent a wire to my office this morning. She says the girl ran away. She's requesting formal assistance in locating and returning her." Caleb stopped walking. Frank stopped beside him. "Dorothea Crane controls the Hale land holdings now. 460 acres southeast, plus Wesley's note at the Harlan Creek Savings Bank." He paused. "She's got Silas Vane representing her interests, and Vane has had a working arrangement with Judge Pryor, going back further than either of them would like discussed publicly. You're telling me to give her back. I'm telling you what you're standing in front of." Frank's voice was not unkind. It was the voice of a man who had spent 15 years watching the distance between what was right and what was possible, and had never fully made his peace with it. "Dorothea will say the child is troubled, unstable, prone to inventing stories, and Vane will have papers filed before you can get a lawyer out of bed." "The child didn't run away," Caleb said. "She was put out on that road." "That's your word and hers. She's 10 years old and she walked 13 miles alone. And Dorothea Crane will say she's a grieving child who makes things up and that you are a well-meaning man who believed her." Frank stopped and turned to face him. "Caleb, I've known you going on 12 years. I respect you more than most men I know. But this woman has resources, and she has Vane, and she has a judge who will do what Vane tells him to do. If she wants that girl back, the law as it currently sits in this county is going to help her get it." Caleb looked down the length of Main Street. A dog lay panting in the shade of the water trough. Two women crossed the street without looking up. The sky was pale and hot and indifferent to everything happening beneath it. "What if the child was harmed there?" he said. Frank was quiet a long moment. "You got proof." Caleb said nothing. "Then I can't help you. Not yet." Frank put his hand briefly on Caleb's shoulder. "I'm sorry, I mean that." Caleb rode home without the black thread. He hadn't forgotten it. He just had other things on his mind. He came back to find Nora at the kitchen table with her notebook open and a stub of pencil in her hand, working through something with the focused intensity of a person solving a problem they've been working on for a long time. She closed the notebook when he came in, but not quickly. Not with the panicked motion of someone hiding something. Just the careful, deliberate motion of someone who had learned to protect what mattered. He poured water, sat down across from her. "I need you to tell me something, and I need the truth." She put the pencil down. "All right." "The notebook. Everything in it. You've had it since 2 weeks before your father died." He looked at her steadily. "Why did you wait this long to run?" She considered the question the way she considered everything thoroughly from all sides, with the particular patience of a child who had been punished before for answering wrong and had learned to be certain before she spoke. "Because I needed to understand what I had," she said. "I knew something was wrong. I knew what I saw and what I heard, but knowing and being able to explain are two different things." She looked at her hands. "My daddy taught me that. He said if you go to someone with the truth and you can't make them see it clearly, all you've done is warn the people who want to bury it." Caleb was quiet. "So I waited," she said. "I kept writing. I kept watching. And then 3 days ago she started searching the barn, and I knew she'd found out the notebook was gone from where I'd hidden it. Her chin came up slightly. I had one night to decide. I took the notebook and I left before she woke up. You left in the dark? Yes, sir. Alone? Yes, sir. He looked at her for a long moment. Nora, Silas Vane is going to file a petition. Dorothea Crane is going to tell a judge you ran away, that you're troubled, that you make things up. He kept his voice even. You understand what that means for what's in that notebook? It means I become the story instead of what I saw, she said. Yes, I know. She met his eyes. That's why I had to get here first, before she could build the story around me. Caleb leaned back in his chair. He looked at this girl 10 years old, red hair, brown eyes that processed the world with a cold clarity that most adults spent a lifetime trying to develop, and he thought about what Frank Beaumont had said on the boardwalk: troubled, unstable, prone to inventing stories. He thought about the notebook, about clean boots on a dead man who never went on the barn roof, about a deed burning in a fire that was supposed to be trash. I need a lawyer, he said, not to Nora, to himself mostly. But Nora answered anyway. Mr. Harding, she said, there's something else. He looked at her. She opened the notebook to a page near the back and pushed it across the table. He looked at the entry. It was dated 3 weeks before her father died, and the translation beside the symbols read, V. Said to D. The brother in Iowa is the problem. D said the brother doesn't know anything. V said keep it that way. Make sure the letters stop. Caleb read it twice. Vane told her to cut off your uncle, he said. Yes, sir. And she did. The letters stopped that same week. I tried to send one myself 2 months later through the post office in town. She found out somehow, and... Nora stopped. Her hand went briefly to her left forearm before she caught herself and lowered it back to the table. Caleb looked at her arm. He didn't say anything. He didn't push. But he looked and she saw him look, and neither of them pretended that something hadn't just been said without words. Your uncle doesn't know your father is dead, Caleb said. No, sir. I don't believe he does. He doesn't know you exist anymore. I reckon not. Caleb stood up and walked to the window. Maggie was in the yard hanging washing on the line, moving with the particular efficient calm of a woman who was thinking hard while keeping her hands busy. He watched her for a moment. I'm going to send a rider to find a lawyer I trust, he said. Out of Copperfield, not here. Not anyone Vane has gotten to. He turned back to Nora. And I'm going to send a telegram to Iowa. Nora looked up. Your uncle has a right to know his brother is gone, Caleb said. And he has a right to know you're here. He paused. The rest is up to him. Something moved through Nora's face, brief. Guarded the expression of a person allowing themselves to want something they're not yet sure is safe to want. He might not come, she said. He doesn't know me, not really. He knew your father. She looked at the table. My daddy said he was stubborn. Said once Abel Hale made up his mind about something, you'd have better luck moving a mountain. Good, Caleb said. We might need that. Maggie came in from the yard in time to hear the last of it. She looked at Caleb, then at Nora, then back at Caleb, with an expression that said she had been thinking the same things he had and had arrived at the same place by a different road. Frank Beaumont came by while you were in town, she said. Caleb raised an eyebrow. He didn't come to the door. He rode slow past the gate and kept going. Maggie set down the empty wash basket. But he looked, deliberately, the way a man looks when he wants you to know he was there without being able to say he was there. Frank's hands are tied, Caleb said. I know. That doesn't mean his conscience is. Maggie looked at Nora. How are you holding up, honey? Nora considered the question with the same seriousness she gave everything. I'm all right, she said. I'm better than yesterday. She paused. Yesterday I didn't know if I'd made the right choice. And today, Maggie said. Nora looked at Caleb. Today I think my daddy was right about you." By the next morning, things had begun to move the way things move in small counties when a powerful woman decides she is not getting what she wants fast enough. Dorothea Crane did not wait for Silas Vane to work through normal channels. She was not a woman who waited for normal channels when other channels were available. The first move came at 7 in the morning. A woman named Mrs. Hollis arrived at Caleb's gate carrying a leather folder and identifying herself as a court-appointed child welfare examiner. She was soft-voiced, well-dressed, and had the particular careful warmth of someone whose warmth was professional rather than natural. Caleb met her at the gate. He read every word of the paper she presented. Then he handed it back. "Any examination of any child on this property," he said, "takes place in the presence of my lawyer. Not before." Mrs. Hollis smiled with her mouth. "Mr. Harding, this is a routine welfare check. Surely you understand?" "I understand the paper you handed me doesn't carry a district court seal," he said. "It carries Judge Pryor's signature. Pryor is a county magistrate. He doesn't have jurisdiction to order an examination on private property without a district court order. You're welcome to go get one." He looked at her steadily. "Good morning, ma'am." Mrs. Hollis left. The folder went with her. Inside the house, Nora was standing in the hallway. She had heard every word. "She'll come back with something stronger," Nora said. "Yes," Caleb said. "She will." "You knew about the jurisdiction thing, about Pryor." "I was a justice of the peace for 6 years," he said, "before I decided it wasn't worth doing it wrong." Nora looked at him. "Why did you quit?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because a man I believed was innocent went to prison because the people with power in this county wanted him there, and I couldn't stop it." He met her eyes. "I decided if I couldn't do it right, I wouldn't do it at all. And now? Now I'm thinking maybe walking away wasn't as clean a decision as I told myself it was." He picked up his hat from the hook. "Stay inside today. Don't go to the gate for anyone." The second move came at noon. A man from the Harlan Creek Savings Bank rode out with papers informing Caleb that his outstanding loan, a modest balance he'd carried without incident for 9 years, had been called in for immediate full repayment. 60 days to settle or face proceedings. Caleb listened to the whole speech standing on his porch with his arms folded. "Tell whoever made that decision," he said when the man finished, "that I'll be moving my accounts to First Federal in Copperfield by end of week. And tell them I said hello." The bankman looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Harding, this isn't something that can simply be—" "Safe travels," Caleb said. He went inside and wrote 2 letters and had his ranch hand, Jesse, ride them to the post office before the bankman had cleared the property line. The third move came on the second evening, in the form of a story in the Harlan Creek Gazette, which Maggie brought in from the gate with her lips pressed flat and her eyes carrying the particular fury of a woman who knew exactly what she was reading and who had written it. She put it on the table in front of Caleb without a word. The story called Nora a troubled child of uncertain temperament, whose history of fabrication had placed a well-meaning but misguided local rancher in an unfortunate legal position. It did not name Dorothea Crane. It did not mention Wesley Hale at all. It used the phrase troubled history twice, and the phrase without basis in fact 3 times. Caleb read it once. Then he looked up at Nora, who had read it over his shoulder without being asked. "She wrote that herself," Nora said. Her voice was flat factual. "Or told someone what to write. That phrase, uncertain temperament. She used to say that about me to visitors when she wanted them to stop listening to me before I'd spoken." She looked at Caleb. "She uses it when she's afraid." "How do you know it means she's afraid?" Maggie said. "Because she only works that hard to make someone small when she thinks they might be big enough to matter." Nora looked at the newspaper. "She wouldn't bother if she wasn't scared of what I'm going to say." Caleb looked at her. "You're right," he said. "It means we're already ahead of her." The lawyer arrived on the morning of the 3rd day. His name was George Aldridge. He was 61 years old, lean with a gray beard and a leather satchel, and the posture of a man who had spent 40 years standing in front of judges and had stopped being impressed by any of them somewhere around year 15. He had ridden overnight from Copperfield after receiving Caleb's letter, and he came through the front door looking like a man who had slept badly and didn't care. He sat down at the kitchen table, opened his satchel, put on his glasses, and looked at Nora over them without speaking first. Nora looked back at him. They held each other's gaze for a long moment. "You're the girl," Aldridge said. "Yes, sir." "Caleb says you have documentation." "Yes, sir." "May I see it?" Nora looked at Caleb. He nodded. She placed the notebook on the table. Aldridge picked it up and read slowly. He did not rush. He turned each page with the care of a man who understood what he was handling. When he reached the entry about Vane and the letters, his pen stopped moving on his own notepad. When he reached the entry about the clean boots, he took his glasses off, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and put them back on. When he finished, he closed the notebook and set it down with the same careful steadiness Caleb had used 3 days ago. "Miss Nora," he said, "how old are you?" "10, sir." "10." He looked at the notebook. "In 40 years of practicing law in the state of Montana, I have had 3 clients who came to me with documentation, this carefully organized and this consistently maintained." He paused. "One of them was a retired federal marshal." Nora looked at him. "Is it enough?" Aldridge leaned forward. "It's strong, very strong. But Vane will attack the notebook itself. He'll say a 10-year-old girl invented a private code and filled it with fabrications to manipulate a grieving situation." He looked at Caleb. "We need corroboration. Someone who can confirm independently what's in here. Someone who isn't Nora." The kitchen went quiet. Maggie spoke from the stove without turning around. "Wesley Hale had a brother in Iowa." Aldridge looked at her. Caleb mentioned the telegram. "There's something else," Maggie said. She turned. "There was a man who worked Wesley's property until 14 months ago. A blacksmith named Isaac Greer. Deaf since birth. Couldn't speak." She looked at Nora. "He left Harlan Creek 2 weeks after Wesley died. Nobody knew where he went. But before he left, he came to my back door at night, and he—" She stopped. Nora had gone absolutely still. Maggie looked at her. "You know what he did?" "He signed something to you," Nora said. Her voice had dropped to almost nothing. "He signed it, and you didn't know what it meant." "I wrote down what I saw him do," Maggie said. "I've had it for 14 months. I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know if it was—" She stopped. "I was afraid." Her voice was flat with self-recrimination. "I was afraid and I kept it, and I should have done something with it a long time ago." Nora opened her notebook to a page near the middle. She pushed it across the table to Maggie. "Is this what he showed you?" Maggie looked at the page. Her hand went to her mouth. "That's it," she said. "That's exactly what he did." Nora looked at Caleb. Her voice was very steady, but her hands were not. "My daddy taught me Isaac's sign language when I was 8, she said. "Isaac and my daddy grew up neighbors. Isaac used to talk to me all the time when I was small." She looked at the notebook. 3 days before my daddy died, Isaac came to the barn where I was sleeping, and he told me what he saw the night my daddy signed the new contract. He showed me who was there. He showed me what Vane did." Her voice didn't break. It simply became quieter, more precise, in the way of someone who has rehearsed saying something so many times, the emotion has been pressed thin by repetition. "I wrote it down that same night." The kitchen held that for a long moment. Aldridge looked at Nora. He looked at the notebook. He looked at Maggie's written account that had been sitting in a drawer for 14 months, waiting for this exact table. Then he stood up and said, "Caleb, I need your fastest rider. I need him going 2 directions at once." Caleb was already on his feet. Iowa first, Aldridge said. Abel Hale needs to be in Harlan Creek. And second, we find Isaac Greer. He looked at Nora with an expression that in a less measured man would have been something close to reverence. Miss Nora, your father didn't just teach you to pay attention. He built you a chain of evidence 14 months before anyone knew it was going to be needed. Nora looked at the table, then at the notebook, then at the window. He knew, she said quietly. He knew something was coming. He just didn't know he wouldn't be here for it. The room was very still. He is here for it, Maggie said. Nora didn't answer, but her hand pressed flat against her chest one more time, not to protect the notebook, which was already on the table. Just pressing against the place where something that could not be taken still lived steady and certain as a heartbeat. Jesse rode out before dawn with 2 letters and instructions that amounted to fast, as the horse will go, and don't stop for anything that isn't an emergency. Caleb watched him leave from the porch, then went inside and sat at the kitchen table with George Aldridge and a pot of Maggie's coffee, and worked through everything they had until the sun came all the way up, and the morning stopped being dark and started being hot. Aldridge had his glasses on and his notepad open and the particular focused energy of a man who had been given a problem worth solving after a long stretch of problems that weren't. He went through the notebook entry by entry, cross-referencing dates, building a sequence that could be laid out in front of a judge in a way that was impossible to dismiss. The contract signing, Aldridge said. Isaac witnessed it. Nora has his account in the notebook. Maggie has her written record of what Isaac signed to her. He looked up. If we can find Isaac and get him to testify either through a sign interpreter or through written statement, that's 3 independent records of the same event. Vane can attack one. He cannot attack all 3 without the attack itself becoming evidence of coordination. If we can find Isaac, Caleb said. Jesse's got contacts in every town between here and the Wyoming line, Maggie said from the stove. If Isaac Greer is within 300 miles, Jesse will find someone who's seen him. Caleb turned his coffee cup in his hands. What about Abel Hale? That's the variable I can't calculate, Aldridge said. He took his glasses off. A man who doesn't know his brother is dead, who doesn't know his niece exists in any practical sense, who receives a telegram out of nowhere asking him to travel 600 miles to a county he's never been to. There's no predicting how a man responds to that. He'll come? Nora said. Both men looked up. She was standing at the hallway doorway, already dressed, her notebook in her hand. She had been listening long enough to follow the conversation. You can't know that, Aldridge said. Not unkindly, just precisely. My daddy wrote him every month for 11 years, Nora said. She walked to the table and sat down. He read me parts of the letters sometimes. He read me parts of Abel's letters back. She set the notebook on the table. Abel Hale drove 4 days through a blizzard in 1871 to help my daddy pull cattle out of a flooded creek bottom. He lost 2 fingers to frostbite doing it. She looked at Aldridge. He'll come. Aldridge looked at her for a moment. Then he wrote something on his notepad and said, All right, he'll come. Caleb almost smiled. He covered it with his coffee cup. The 4th day brought something none of them had arranged, and none of them had expected. It came in the form of a woman named Ruth Caswell, who arrived at the front gate on foot at 7 in the morning, carrying nothing but a small cloth bag and an expression that had been rehearsed so many times it had worn itself smooth. Maggie saw her from the kitchen window and went to the door. Caleb came out behind her. Ruth Caswell was somewhere in her late 50s, gray hair pulled back hard, a dress that had been expensive once and wasn't anymore. She held herself like a person who had been ashamed for a long time and had recently decided that shame was a luxury she couldn't afford. I need to speak with Mr. Harding, she said. It's about Silas Vane. Caleb came down off the porch. He looked at her. She looked back without flinching, which told him something. You'd better come inside, he said. Ruth Caswell sat at the kitchen table that had become, over 4 days, something like a command post. She put her bag on her lap and did not touch the coffee Maggie set in front of her. She looked at Nora, who was sitting across from her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "You're Wesley Hale's girl," Ruth said. "Yes, ma'am." Ruth's jaw worked once. "I knew your father slightly. He fixed a wheel on my wagon once and wouldn't take payment for it." She stopped. "He was a decent man." "Yes, ma'am, he was." Ruth looked at Caleb. "I was married to Judge Harlan Pryor for 19 years, she said. "We separated 14 months ago. I don't imagine that's public knowledge. Harlan has worked very hard to keep it quiet." She reached into her bag and pulled out a bundle of letters tied with a piece of kitchen twine. She put them on the table. "My husband was not careful about what he put in writing. He trusted that I would never use it." She looked at her hands. "He was right for a very long time." Aldridge had come in from the back room. He stood in the doorway, looking at the letters on the table, with the careful attention of a man who understood exactly what he might be looking at. "Mrs. Pryor," he said. "Caswell," she said. "I've gone back to my family name." "Mrs. Caswell, do you understand what you're offering?" "I'm offering letters in my husband's handwriting, documenting his arrangement with Silas Vane going back 11 years, she said. 4 separate land cases in Harlan County where rulings went the way Vane needed them to go, and certain considerations were exchanged afterward. Her voice was clipped and brittle at the edges, the voice of someone saying something they have said 10,000 times in their own head and have finally allowed out into the air. The Wesley Hale matter is not the first. It may be the worst, but it is not the first. The kitchen was absolutely quiet. Nora was looking at Ruth Caswell with those brown eyes that measured everything without announcing that they were doing it. "Why now?" she said. Ruth looked at her. "Because you're Tom, because you're Wesley's daughter," she said, catching herself. "And because I have watched from very close range what it looks like when a powerful person uses the law like a personal weapon and calls it justice." Her voice hardened in a way that sounded like something finally solidifying after a long time liquid. "I've watched it for 11 years. I kept telling myself it wasn't my business, that I didn't know enough, that I couldn't be certain." She looked at the letters. "And then a 10-year-old girl walked 13 miles alone in August, and I decided I was done with certainty as an excuse." Nora's throat moved. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you." Just the 2 words. Simple, direct, with the full weight of what it cost a person to hear them from a child they'd only just met. Ruth's chin quivered once. She stopped it. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Wait until it's done." Aldridge was already at the table, already untying the twine, already reading with both hands flat on the first letter, like he needed to anchor himself to what he was seeing. Caleb stood back and watched his lawyer's face, and saw in it the particular expression of a man who has been handed something that changes the shape of a fight he was prepared to win on points and has just realized he might win it clean. "Caleb," Aldridge said without looking up, "we need to file for a district court hearing. Not county court. District." He turned a page. "Pryor cannot be anywhere near this proceeding. Not in the same building. Can you get a district judge? With these letters and that notebook, and a deaf witness, and Abel Hale coming from Iowa, I can get a district judge to ride through a snowstorm." Aldridge looked up. "I'm filing today, this afternoon if Jesse can get me to Copperfield by 3. Caleb looked at the clock on the wall. "Jesse's not back. Then I'll ride myself." Aldridge was already closing his satchel. He looked at Ruth Caswell. "Mrs. Caswell, are you prepared to testify?" Ruth looked at her hands on the table. Then she looked up. "My husband will deny everything. Vane will try to destroy whatever credibility I have left." "Yes," Aldridge said. "He will." "My credibility," Ruth said, "is not something my husband left me a great deal of to begin with." She straightened her shoulders. "I don't have much more to lose, but that child does." She looked at Nora. And I know what it looks like when someone uses the law to take everything from a person who has no way to fight back. I have watched it happen to other people for years and told myself it wasn't my concern. Something moved through her face, grief and anger, and the particular expression of a person paying a debt they should have paid a long time ago. It is my concern. It always was. Aldridge nodded once. He snapped his satchel closed, stood, and looked at Caleb. While I'm filing, you keep that gate closed and you don't let anyone on this property who isn't carrying a district court document. Pryor's orders mean nothing now. Vane's filings mean nothing until a district judge has reviewed this case. He picked up his hat. I'll send word by tonight. He left. The kitchen exhaled. Ruth Caswell stayed for 2 hours. She and Nora sat at the table and talked in the careful way of people who are new to each other and both accustomed to choosing their words with precision. Ruth asked about Wesley. Nora told her things, small things, specific things, the kind of details that only a daughter would know. The way he took his coffee. The particular whistle he used to call the dogs. The fact that he had read the same 3 books so many times, the spines had given out and he'd tied them with string to keep the pages together. Ruth listened to all of it with her hands folded on the table and her eyes very still. He deserved better than what happened to him, she said. Yes, ma'am, Nora said. He did. She paused. But he also spent his whole life doing what was right even when it cost him. He used to say that a man who only does right when it's easy isn't doing right. He's just doing convenient. She looked at the table. I think he'd be glad that what he taught me is what's going to fix this. Ruth was quiet for a moment. You sound like him. Nora looked up. The way he said things, Ruth said. Straightforward. No fuss. She almost smiled. He was like that at the wagon that day too. Just did what needed doing and moved on. Nora turned that over slowly. Then she pressed her lips together and nodded once, and the expression on her face was the expression of a person receiving something they had been hungry for, without knowing how hungry they were. A stranger's small specific memory of a person they loved. Proof that that person had existed in the world beyond the edges of their own experience. The 5th day was the one Caleb had been bracing for. It started with 4 riders coming through the front gate before sunrise. Not slowly, not with any pretense of formality. They came through like they'd been told the gate would be open, and were surprised to find Caleb standing in the yard with a lantern and a rifle, and the particular stillness of a man who has been awake since 3 in the morning because he knew something was coming. The lead rider pulled up hard. He was broad, wearing a badge Caleb didn't recognize, and he had the voice of a man accustomed to people moving when he spoke. Caleb Harding. We have a warrant for the minor child Nora Hale signed by Judge Harlan Pryor of Harlan County, authorizing her immediate return to her legal guardian Dorothea Crane. Caleb held the lantern up and looked at the badge. That's a deputy's badge out of Silver Fork, he said. Silver Fork is 2 counties west. You're a considerable distance from your jurisdiction. The warrant covers county lines. Does it? Caleb kept his voice level. Who filed for this warrant? Mrs. Dorothea Crane through her attorney Silas Vane of Copper Falls. And Judge Pryor signed it. Last evening, yes, sir. Caleb lowered the lantern slightly. That's interesting, he said, because as of 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon, a petition for district court review of this matter was filed in Copperfield by attorney George Aldridge. A district judge has been assigned. A stay of all county-level proceedings is currently in effect pending that review. He looked at the lead deputy with an expression that was not hostile and was not warm, and had in it the absolute calm of a man who has done his homework and knows it. Which means Judge Pryor's warrant is currently superseded by district court authority. Which means if you attempt to remove any person from this property tonight, you will be doing so in contempt of district court proceedings. The deputy stared at him. Sir, I have a signed warrant. You have a piece of paper signed by a county magistrate who does not currently have jurisdiction over this matter. Caleb said. "I would strongly suggest you confirm that with your own legal counsel before you take another step onto my property." He looked past the lead rider at the 3 men behind him. "All 4 of you." Nobody moved for a long moment. One of the riders in the back shifted his horse sideways. Another one looked at the lead deputy and said nothing with his mouth, but said quite a lot with his expression. The lead deputy reached into his coat, pulled out a notepad, wrote something, tore the page off, and held it out. "That's a contact number in Silver Fork," he said. "When your lawyer confirms the stay, we'll need verification in writing." Caleb took the paper. "You'll have it by morning. We'll be back at first light." "I'll have coffee ready," Caleb said. He stood in the yard until the sound of hooves faded west. Then he went inside, unloaded the rifle, and sat down at the kitchen table. Nora was in the hallway. She had heard everything. She looked at him with those steady brown eyes and said, "You knew they were coming." "I suspected." "You knew about the stay." "Aldridge sent word at midnight. Jesse got back with the confirmation an hour ago." He looked at her. "You should sleep." "I know." She didn't move. "Mr. Harding, she filed that warrant before Aldridge even reached Copperfield. She had it ready." Her voice was very flat, the particular flatness of a child processing a fear too large to carry with any other expression. "She planned all of it. The road, the running. She planned for me to run so she could use the law to bring me back on her terms." "Yes," Caleb said. "That's what she did. If she gets me back through a warrant, through a legal process with a deputy and a judge's signature." Nora stopped. Started again. "Then I'm a runaway. And the notebook is something a runaway girl made up to cause trouble. And Isaac and Abel and Mrs. Caswell and everything Aldridge filed becomes the story of a man who was fooled by a difficult child." Her jaw tightened. "She's very good at this." "She's good," Caleb said. "She's not good enough." Nora looked at him. "How do you know?" He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Because she made one mistake," he said. "She underestimated you for 10 years, and she kept underestimating you every single day after your father died. She thought a 10-year-old girl with a notebook full of symbols was manageable. She thought she could put you on a road and use the law to erase whatever you said afterward." He looked at her steadily. "A person who underestimates their opponent that badly has already lost. They just don't know it yet." Nora sat down across from him. She pulled the notebook toward her and held it with both hands, not opening it, just holding it the way she'd held it for 14 months, the way a person holds the one thing in the world they are certain cannot be taken as long as they are standing. "My daddy said," she started, then stopped. Tried again. "He said the truth doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to still be true in the morning." She looked at the notebook. "He said that's all truth has to do. Survive the night." Caleb looked at this girl 10 years old. Red hair, 14 months of survival, written in symbols in a worn-out notebook. Her dead father's voice coming through every word she said, and felt something in his chest that he had not felt in a long time. Not quite grief. Not quite hope. The particular fullness that happens when something you stopped believing in quietly turns out to still exist. "Go to bed," he said. "It's going to be a long few days." She stood. She went to the hallway and stopped with her hand on the doorframe. She didn't turn around. "Mr. Harding," she said. "Yeah. He was right about you." Her voice was quiet. "My daddy. He was right." He didn't answer. He sat at the table and listened to her footsteps down the hall and the small sound of her door closing. And outside the night was very dark and very still. And somewhere west of Harlan Creek, 4 riders were deciding whether the ground beneath them was as solid as they'd been told it was. Caleb stayed at the table a long time after that. He thought about Wesley Hale, who had fixed a stranger's wagon wheel, and read the same 3 books until they fell apart, and whistled for his dogs, and built a chain of evidence in his daughter's memory. Before the world took him, because he had known the way. Good men sometimes know that the world was not going to be fair to the people he left behind. He thought about what it meant that a man like that had spoken his name to his daughter. Had said, "If everything falls apart, go there." That man keeps his word. He thought about whether he was still the man Wesley Hale had described. He thought about the warrant waiting for morning and the district court stay, and Abel Hale somewhere on a train from Iowa, and Isaac Greer somewhere in the Montana Territory, and Ruth Caswell's bundle of letters sitting in Aldridge's satchel in Copperfield. And he thought about Nora in the room down the hall, lying flat on her back, the way she'd been practicing arms at her sides, working on the unfamiliar discipline of being still without waiting for something to go wrong. He sat with all of it until the sky began to lighten in the east. Then he stood up, poured out the cold coffee, and started a fresh pot. There was work to do. And for the first time in a long time, that fact felt less like a burden and more like a reason. Abel Hale arrived on the 6th morning, and he arrived the way Nora had said he would, without warning, without fanfare, and with the particular forward momentum of a man who had decided something on a train platform in Iowa and had not stopped deciding it since. He was 56 years old, broad across the shoulders, with Wesley's same jaw, and none of Wesley's patience written anywhere on his face. He came through the front gate on a rented horse that looked tired in the way horses look when they've been pushed harder than they're accustomed to, and he stepped down in the yard and looked at the house and then at Caleb standing on the porch and said, "I got a telegram 6 days ago that told me my brother was dead." "Yes, sir," Caleb said. "I've been on 3 trains and 2 horses since then." Abel Hale's voice was controlled in the way of a man managing something very large in a very small space. "I want to see my niece." Caleb stepped aside. "Come in." Abel Hale walked through the door and stopped in the kitchen doorway. Nora was at the table with the notebook open and Aldridge's notes spread out in front of her, and she looked up when the shadow fell across the room, and for a moment neither of them moved. Abel looked at her the way a person looks at something they expected to be smaller and found instead to be exactly the right size. He looked at her red hair and her brown eyes, and the straight line of her shoulders, and the careful way she was holding herself, and something in his face broke open and then closed again very fast, the way a door opens and shuts in a wind. "You look like him," Abel said. His voice had changed, still controlled, but thinner. "Around the eyes." "People say that," Nora said. She stood up from the table. She looked at him with those measuring eyes running through the same calculation she ran on everything, and then she said, "He read me your letters, parts of them. He said you were the most stubborn man in Iowa." Abel's breath came out in a short, involuntary sound that was not quite a laugh. "He said that. He meant it as a compliment." "I know he did." Abel crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and put both hands on her shoulders and looked at her face up close, and said nothing for a moment. His jaw was working. His eyes were very bright. "I didn't know," he said, "about Wesley. About any of it. I thought he'd just stopped writing. I thought—" He stopped. "I should have come sooner. I should have come when the letters stopped." "She made sure they stopped," Nora said. Her voice was steady. "You couldn't have known. I should have known anyway." His hands tightened slightly on her shoulders. "I'm here now." Nora looked at him for one more moment. Then she did something she had not done with anyone except Caleb. She leaned forward and put her forehead briefly against his chest, just for a second, just long enough to be real. Abel Hale closed his eyes and held on. Maggie turned back to the stove and didn't say anything for a while. Aldridge arrived an hour later with news that changed the temperature of everything. He came through the door with his satchel under his arm and the brisk energy of a man who has been moving fast for 6 days and has found that it suits him. "District court hearing is set for day after tomorrow," he said, pulling out his chair. "Judge Raymond Holt presiding. Holt has been on the district bench for 18 years. He has no connection to Pryor, no connection to Vane, and a reputation for running a courtroom that doesn't tolerate theater." He looked around the table. "That's good for us, and bad for Dorothea Crane, because what she has is theater, and what we have is evidence." What about Isaac Greer? Caleb said. Aldridge set a folded paper on the table. Jesse found him. The room went still. He's been living outside a town called Mill Rock, 40 miles northeast, working for a horse breeder. Aldridge looked at Nora. He's agreed to come. He'll be here by tomorrow evening. He paused. He has one condition. What condition? Caleb said. He wants to speak to Nora first, before anyone else, before the hearing. Aldridge folded his hands on the table. He left without telling her what he knew. He's been carrying that for 14 months. Nora said nothing. She looked at the table and pressed her lips together and breathed out very slowly. All right, she said. Aldridge nodded. He looked at Abel. Mr. Hale, your testimony regarding the original will, the regular correspondence with your brother, and your complete ignorance of the estate proceedings is critical. Vane will try to paint you as a bitter relative with a financial motive. I need you to answer every question he asks with the same amount of words you'd use to describe the weather. No more. Abel looked at him. You're telling me to be less. I'm telling you that when a man like Vane can't get a rise out of a witness, he looks small, Aldridge said. Your brother raised a daughter who sat across from me for 2 hours and never once gave me anything I could use against her. I'd like the same consideration from his brother. Abel looked at Nora sideways. Nora looked back at him. Fine, Abel said. The hearing date was 2 days away, and Dorothea Crane used every hour of those 2 days. On the afternoon before the hearing, a man arrived at the gate who identified himself as a representative of the district court, sent to conduct a preliminary welfare assessment of the child. He had correct paperwork, a district court letterhead, and the smooth professional manner of someone who had been briefed carefully. Caleb read every word of his paperwork. Then he called Aldridge out from the back room and let the lawyer read it too. Aldridge handed it back. The letterhead is legitimate, he said. The authorization number is not. This form requires a case number assigned by the presiding judge's clerk. This number doesn't exist in Holt's case registry. He looked at the man through the gate. I'd suggest you go back to whoever sent you and tell them they need a real document. The man left without another word. She's panicking, Aldridge said as they walked back to the house. Good, Nora said from the porch steps where she had been sitting and listening. Panicking people make mistakes. Aldridge looked at her over his glasses. Yes, he said. They do. Isaac Greer arrived the following evening just before dark, riding in the wagon of the horse breeder he worked for, who had apparently decided that driving a man 40 miles was a reasonable thing to do for someone who had asked quietly and meant it. He was somewhere past 50, lean, with weathered hands, and the particular attentive stillness of a person who has navigated a hearing world for a lifetime by reading everything that words couldn't carry. He climbed down from the wagon and stood in the yard and looked at Nora. She stood on the porch steps and looked back at him. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then Nora walked down the steps and stopped in front of him. And Isaac Greer looked at her face, and his own face did something complicated and difficult that he clearly hadn't expected to happen in front of other people. He raised his hands, slowly, the way a person raises their hands when they're not sure the gesture is going to be received the way they mean it. Nora watched his hands, then she responded. Her own hands moved in the small, precise language her father had taught her when she was 8 years old, and Caleb, watching from the porch, understood none of the words, but understood everything about the weight of the exchange. Two people speaking in a language built between a dead man and his daughter across 14 months of separation and guilt and survival. It lasted several minutes. Nora's face moved through things while it happened. Not crying, never crying, but moving through things, the way weather moves through a landscape, fast and total, and leaving everything slightly changed. When they finished, Isaac put one hand briefly on the top of her head, the way a man touches something he has been afraid he lost, and then lowered it. Nora turned and looked at Caleb on the porch. He saw everything, she said. Her voice was even. He was in the barn. He saw the contract. He saw what Vane did to make my daddy sign it." She paused. "And he saw what happened the night my daddy died. It wasn't an accident." The porch was very quiet. Caleb looked at Aldridge. Aldridge looked at Isaac Greer. "Can you write?" Aldridge said, speaking slowly and clearly. Isaac nodded. He reached into his coat and pulled out a piece of paper already folded. He held it out to Aldridge. Aldridge took it and opened it and read it, and when he was done, he folded it back up with both hands and held it like the notebook, like something that had changed the shape of the room around it. "This is a written statement," Aldridge said. "Dated, signed, witnessed by his employer." He looked at Caleb. "It corroborates every relevant entry in the notebook. Every single one." The morning of the hearing, the courthouse in Copperfield opened at 8 and was full by 7:30. Word had moved through the county the way true things move, not through the Gazette, not through any official channel, but person to person in low voices, with the weight of something people recognized without being able to name. Wesley Hale had been liked. He had been the kind of man whose absence left a specific shape in the places he used to be, and people had felt that shape for 14 months without knowing what had made it. Tom Brooks's daughter, Nora Hale. Wesley's girl. People said it to each other on the street and in the dry goods store and outside the post office, with the particular tone of people realizing they had missed something important and were not going to miss the rest of it. By the time Caleb walked Nora through the side entrance with Aldridge beside them, there were people standing outside the building who had no seat to go to and had come anyway. Nora wore a clean dress Maggie had found and pressed carefully. Her hair was braided. She carried nothing. She looked exactly like what she was, a 10-year-old girl, and Aldridge had told her that morning over breakfast to let that be enough. Don't add anything he'd said. Don't take anything away. Just be what you are and tell the truth in every direction they push it. Dorothea Crane arrived through the main entrance with Silas Vane and 2 associates. She wore mourning black, still the widow, and she moved through the gallery with the practiced confidence of a woman who had walked into rooms and owned them for a long time. Her face was composed. Her hands were still. She did not look at Caleb. She looked at Nora, and Nora looked back, and it lasted 4 seconds, and Dorothea looked away first. Aldridge noticed. He said nothing. Judge Raymond Holt called the court to order at 9 o'clock. He was a compact man, 60 years old, with the face of someone who had stopped announcing his thoughts somewhere around 40 and hadn't started again. He looked at the gallery, at the 2 tables, at the child sitting beside the tall lawyer, and he said, "This is a legal proceeding. Anyone who treats it as entertainment will be removed. Are we clear?" It was not a question. The gallery went quiet. Vane went first. He was exactly as smooth as Aldridge had promised, the kind of smooth that looked like sincerity at a distance. He laid out Dorothea's claim in measured, sympathetic language. A grieving woman, struggling to manage a difficult estate, and a troubled child, who had run away and been taken in by a well-meaning rancher acting outside any legal authority. He spoke about the filed contract as the legitimate document and Wesley's original arrangement as something that had simply been superseded in the natural course of estate management. He used the phrase behavioral history 4 times. He used the phrase without corroboration 3 times. He never raised his voice. He was very, very good. Then Aldridge stood up. He built the case the way Caleb had watched him build it across 6 days at that kitchen table, post by post, tight, no gaps. The dates in the notebook against the dates of Vane's visits to the Hale property. Isaac Greer's written statement corroborating every critical entry. Ruth Caswell's letters documenting 11 years of arrangements between Vane and Judge Pryor. Abel Hale's testimony establishing the existence of an original agreement that had never included Silas Vane in any capacity. The specific entry in Nora's notebook, recording Vane's own words, "The brother in Iowa is the problem." When Aldridge read that line aloud, Vane's pen stopped moving on his notepad. Aldridge saw it. He didn't acknowledge it. He kept moving. Abel Hale testified first. He sat in the witness chair with his hands on his knees and answered every question Aldridge asked in exactly the number of words required, and not one more. When Vane cross-examined him, looking for the bitterness and financial motive he'd been counting on, he found instead a man with the flat, patient economy of someone who has been told to say less than he feels and has decided to be very good at it. Vane tried 4 different angles. Abel Hale gave him 4 different versions of the same stone wall. Eventually, Vane sat down. Then Aldridge said, "Your Honor, plaintiff calls Isaac Greer." Isaac came to the witness stand with his employer beside him to interpret his signs. He sat down and folded his hands in his lap and looked at the judge with the direct, unhurried attention of a man who has waited 14 months to sit in this chair and intends to make the most of it. Aldridge established who he was, where he had worked, how long he had known Wesley Hale. Then he asked about the night the contract was signed, and Isaac's hands began to move. The interpreter's voice was steady and flat, and translated everything without inflection, which made the content of what Isaac was saying more powerful, not less. He had been in the barn. He had seen Vane arrive after dark. He had seen what was said and what was done, and why Wesley Hale's hand had not been steady on the pen. He had seen things that a man who could not speak had watched in complete silence and carried in complete silence for 14 months because he had not known who to tell them to and had been afraid of what telling would cost him. When he finished, the courtroom had the particular stillness of people who have been told something they cannot unhear. Vane cross-examined carefully, trying to establish that a deaf witness relying on lip-reading in a poorly lit barn could not provide reliable testimony. Isaac watched Vane's mouth and hands throughout the cross-examination with the focused attention of a man who had been reading the world through exactly those channels for 50 years. Every answer came back precise, specific, unshakable. After 20 minutes, Vane sat down. Then Aldridge said, "Your Honor, plaintiff calls Nora Hale." Vane was on his feet immediately. "Objection. The witness is 10 years old. Her testimony is directly material to the central facts of this proceeding," Aldridge said without raising his voice. "The court has full authority to hear from any competent witness regardless of age. I would ask that opposing counsel not attempt to prevent this court from hearing from the very child whose welfare is at issue." Judge Holt looked at Vane with an expression that said he had already formed an opinion, and it was not favorable. Overruled. The child may testify. Nora stood up. She did not look at Caleb, though he had been watching her for 2 hours with the rigid stillness of a man who has run out of things to do with his hands. She walked to the witness stand and climbed up and sat down and folded her hands in her lap, exactly the way she had folded them at Caleb's kitchen table 6 days ago, when she had decided to trust him with everything she had. She looked at Judge Holt and nowhere else. Aldridge walked toward her slowly. "Nora, in your own words, can you tell this court what happened on the morning of August the 9th? Nora looked at the judge. "My stepmother put me in the wagon before sunrise. She drove for about 2 hours and stopped on the South Trail. She told me to get out." Her voice was level, factual, the voice of someone who has told herself the truth about something so many times it no longer has the power to ambush her. "She said I'd been in her desk. She said I was more trouble than I was worth, and it was a good time to simplify matters." Not a sound in the gallery. "Those were her words," Aldridge said. "Yes, sir. She's careful with language. She always says exactly what she means and nothing more." "What did you do then?" "I started walking to Mr. Harding's ranch." "Why Mr. Harding specifically?" Nora's voice didn't change. "Because my daddy told me he was the only honest man in the county, and I needed someone honest." She looked at her hands for just a moment, then back at the judge. "I didn't have anywhere else to go that would be safe, and my daddy's word was the most reliable thing I had." Aldridge let that sit. Then he held up the notebook. "Nora, can you tell this court what this is?" "That's my notebook. My daddy and I made the writing system together when I was 7. I used it to record everything I saw and heard after he got sick." "And the entries in this notebook, can you vouch for their accuracy?" "Yes, sir. I wrote them down as close to the event as I could. Sometimes the same night, sometimes within an hour." She looked at the notebook with the particular expression of someone looking at the one thing in the world they were absolutely sure of. I knew that memory changes. My daddy taught me that. He said write it down fast and write it true, and don't add what you wished you'd seen. Just what you saw. Aldridge nodded. No further questions. Vane stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He walked toward the witness stand, with the measured confidence of a man who had cross-examined hundreds of witnesses and believed in his ability to find the place where any story came apart. He looked at Nora. Nora looked at him. "Nora," he said with warmth so carefully assembled it had stopped resembling anything natural. "I know this is very difficult. I just have a few questions." "All right," Nora said. "You testified that your father taught you this writing system when you were 7 years old. Most children don't retain complex systems with great accuracy. Would you say your memory is unusually reliable?" "I remember everything my daddy taught me," Nora said. "He was very careful about what he said to me. He wanted to make sure I understood." "And yet you were accessing your stepmother's private papers without permission." Vane tilted his head. "You admit that?" "Yes, sir." "Why?" "Because I was afraid." She said it without hesitation. I had been afraid for a long time. I needed to understand what was happening to my daddy's property. "Is it possible," Vane said carefully, "that fear caused you to misinterpret what you found legal documents are complex? Even adults make errors reading them." "I compared them line by line," Nora said. "I have good reading comprehension. My daddy made sure of it." She met his eyes. "And I had Isaac's account to check against. And they matched." Vane shifted direction. "You're a very intelligent young girl, but intelligence can sometimes cause us to see patterns that aren't there. Wouldn't you say that's possible?" Nora considered it for exactly the amount of time it deserved. "I would also say," she replied, "that it's possible for a person to hope a 10-year-old girl can be made to doubt what she saw by someone who needs her to doubt it." She looked at him steadily. "That's a pattern too." The gallery exhaled all at once. Vane's expression didn't break. He was too good for that. But something in the quality of his stillness changed the difference between a man who is composed and a man who is working very hard to stay that way. He spent 15 more minutes approaching from different angles. Every time Nora answered precisely consistently without heat or performance. She told the truth in every direction he pushed it, and the truth held every time. When Vane finally said no further questions and walked back to his table, he walked with the gait of a man still performing confidence and fully aware that everyone watching could see the performance. Aldridge said, "Plaintiff calls Ruth Caswell." Dorothea Crane's head came up. For the first time since she had entered the courtroom, her composure shifted. Not dramatically, just a tightening around the eyes, a stillness in her hands that was too deliberate. The stillness of someone who has just seen the thing they were afraid of walk through a door. Caleb saw it. Aldridge saw it. Across the courtroom, Nora saw it too. She looked at Caleb for the first time since she'd taken the stand. Their eyes met across the packed room, across 6 days and 13 miles, and every decision both of them had made that had brought them to this exact moment. He gave her the smallest nod. She turned back to face the front, as Ruth Caswell walked through the side door and settled into the witness chair with the deliberate stillness of a woman who has been afraid for a very long time and has chosen, at considerable cost to herself, to stop. Ruth Caswell did not fidget. She looked at Aldridge and answered every question he put to her, with the flat, careful precision of a woman who had rehearsed this moment in her head so many times that the actual doing of it had become, if not easy, at least something she could survive. She confirmed her name. Her marriage to Judge Harlan Pryor. The letters. She identified each one in Harlan's handwriting. Each one another thread in the same pattern, 11 years of arrangements and considerations and favorable rulings that had gone one way when they should have gone another. When Aldridge finished reading the last letter into the record, the courtroom had the quality of a room where the ground has shifted and nobody is quite ready to trust their footing. Vane stood for cross-examination. He was still composed. The man was a professional, and professionals don't break in public. But something had changed in the temperature of how he was moving tighter, more deliberate, the difference between a man who is certain and a man who is working to remain it. "Mrs. Caswell," he said, "you and Judge Pryor separated under difficult circumstances." "We did?" Ruth said. A bitter separation colors a witness's perspective. A bitter spouse with 9 letters in her husband's own handwriting, Ruth said, is a documented witness. She looked at him without blinking. "You might want to reconsider your approach, Mr. Vane." Something moved through the gallery. Not laughter, not a gasp, but the sound a room makes when it recognizes that something just landed that cannot be taken back. Judge Holt wrote something on his paper. Vane tried 2 more angles, found them equally unproductive, and sat down. Aldridge stood. "Plaintiff rests your honor." Holt looked at the defense table. "Mr. Vane." Vane called 2 witnesses. The first was a woman who had worked in the Crane household and testified to Nora's difficult temperament and habit of fabrication. Aldridge established on cross that she had been hired by Dorothea 4 months after Wesley's death, had never met. Wesley had no knowledge of any original documents and was currently still on Dorothea Crane's payroll. She left the stand looking smaller than she'd arrived. The second was a doctor from Harlan Creek who had seen Nora twice in the aftermath of her father's death and characterized her as showing grief-related behavioral disruption. Aldridge asked whether that was unusual in a child who had recently lost her father. The doctor said no. Aldridge asked whether it indicated a pattern of fabrication. The doctor said not necessarily. Aldridge thanked him and sat down. Then Vane said, "Defense calls Dorothea Crane." The gallery stirred. Dorothea stood and walked to the witness stand with the bearing of a woman who had made a decision about how this was going to go, and intended to carry it out completely. She was good. Caleb had known she would be. She spoke of her grief for Wesley, her struggle to manage the estate alone, her genuine concern for Nora, and the pain of finding her in the private study, going through documents a child had no business touching. She spoke of the morning on the trail with the careful language of someone who had scripted every word. Nora had become distressed, had exited the wagon despite Dorothea's protests. She had been concerned and had returned to look for her as soon as she was able. She did not say she had put Nora on the trail. She said Nora had gotten out. She did not say she had driven away. She said she had gone to get help. Aldridge stood up. He did not move toward her immediately. He stood at his table and let the silence work for a moment, long enough for Dorothea to begin calculating what was coming, and then he walked toward her at an unhurried pace and said in a conversational tone, "Mrs. Crane, you testified that Nora became distressed and exited the wagon of her own accord." "Yes." "You attempted to stop her." "Of course." "And yet a 10-year-old girl in distress on foot on a remote trail in August was permitted to walk away." He paused. "You had a wagon and a horse, and you did not follow her." Dorothea's jaw tightened slightly. "She ran. I couldn't—" "You couldn't follow a 10-year-old girl on foot while you had a horse and wagon." "She was very fast." "She was barefoot," Aldridge said. "And you went home." He picked up a paper. "This court order was filed with Judge Pryor's office at 6:45 in the evening on August the 9th. According to your own testimony, Nora exited the wagon at approximately midday." He looked at her. 6 hours after a 10-year-old girl disappeared from a remote trail in August, your first action was to contact Silas Vane and have a court order prepared. Not the sheriff, not a search party, your lawyer. Dorothea said, "I panicked." "You panicked," Aldridge repeated, "and your panic expressed itself through legal filings rather than a search." He set the paper down. "Mrs. Crane Sheriff Beaumont's office has no record of any missing child report filed by you or anyone acting on your behalf on August the 9th or any subsequent date." Silence. "Your first and only action," Aldridge said, "upon losing track of a 10-year-old child was to call your lawyer. Can you help this court understand why the law was more urgent to you than the child?" Dorothea looked at Vane. Vane's face was professionally neutral. His pen had stopped moving. "I wanted her returned safely through proper channels," she said. "Through proper channels," Aldridge said. He nodded slowly. Then he looked at her with an expression that was entirely without aggression and entirely without mercy. "Mrs. Crane Nora testified that you told her she was more trouble than she was worth, and that it was a good time to simplify matters. Do you dispute those words?" A pause. "She's a child. Her recollection. Do you dispute those specific words?" Dorothea's hands were very still in her lap. Her face was still arranged correctly, but something behind it, something that had been held in careful place for 14 months, was beginning to move. "I may have said something to that effect," she said. "I was frustrated. People say things." "You told a 10-year-old girl she was not worth the trouble," Aldridge said, "on a remote trail in August, and then you drove away and called your lawyer." He stepped slightly closer, not menacing, simply close enough that she had to hold his gaze or visibly look away. "Mrs. Crane, is it possible that you put Nora on that trail not out of frustration, but because you knew she had that notebook, and because you needed her to run so that you could use a court order to frame her return as a recovery rather than what it actually was, the silencing of the only witness to what happened to Wesley Hale?" Dorothea looked at Vane. Vane did not look back. And then Dorothea Crane did something that no court performance and no amount of preparation could have prevented, because it came from the place beneath preparation where the real thing lives. She broke. Not gradually. Not gracefully. She broke the way a thing breaks when the pressure has been too long and too great, and the last thing holding it in place finally gives all at once. "Wesley was supposed to sign everything over," she said, and her voice came out wrong, too high, stripped of the careful widow raw underneath. "We had an arrangement before he got sick. He promised me. He promised me that land would be managed properly, that I wouldn't be left with nothing when he was gone. And instead he had a will drawn up that left everything in trust for a girl who isn't even—" She stopped herself. But the gallery had heard it. The judge had heard it. The gallery went absolutely silent. Nora's face did not change. She watched her stepmother from across the courtroom with the same steady brown eyes she'd watched everything with for 10 years, and she did not look surprised. And that the absence of surprise in a 10-year-old girl who had just heard her stepmother almost say what she'd almost said was the most devastating thing in the room. Judge Holt said very quietly, "Mrs. Crane, I would strongly advise you to stop speaking." Dorothea stopped. She looked at Vane. Vane looked at the table. Aldridge stepped back. "No further questions, Your Honor." Vane did not re-examine. Dorothea Crane walked back to her table and sat down and did not move again. The recess lasted 45 minutes. Caleb sat in the hallway outside the courtroom on a bench against the wall with Nora on one side and Abel Hale on the other, and none of them spoke much. The building moved around them. Boots on floorboards, voices in other rooms, the muffled sound of the gallery resettling itself after what it had just witnessed. But the bench where the three of them sat existed in its own particular quiet. Nora had her hands in her lap and she was looking at the floor. Not the way people look at the floor when they are defeated, the way they look when they are holding something too large to process all at once and need somewhere neutral to rest their eyes while they work through it. "She almost said it," Nora said finally. "Yes," Caleb said. "She almost said I wasn't his." Nora's voice was flat and steady. "She's believed that for a long time, that I wasn't really Wesley's, that I was something she had to manage instead of someone she had to love." She was quiet for a moment. "My daddy knew she thought that. He never said so, but he knew. That's why he made the will the way he did. That's why he showed it to me." Her hands tightened slightly in her lap. "He was protecting me from something he hoped would never happen." Abel looked at her. The muscle in his jaw worked once. "It happened," he said. "And you handled it." "We handled it," Nora said. She looked at Caleb the way she'd looked at him across the courtroom when Ruth Caswell walked through the door, like he was a fixed point in a room that was moving. Caleb put his hand briefly over hers. "It's not finished yet," he said, "but it's close." Aldridge came out of a side room with his satchel under his arm and the expression of a man who has just done something he is professionally satisfied with and is not going to say so out loud. He sat down at the end of the bench and looked at his notes for a moment. "Holt is thorough," he said. "He'll take his time with the ruling, but I've been in front of enough judges to read a room, and that room came apart the moment she started talking about arrangements and promises." He looked at Nora over his glasses. "You held up well in there." "I told the truth," Nora said. "That's all I did." "That's all you needed to do," Aldridge said. Truth told plainly is the hardest thing for a practiced liar to defend against, because they spend so much time building the story around it that they forget the truth itself doesn't need a story. It just needs to be said. Nora looked at him. "My daddy used to say something like that." "Smart man," Aldridge said. He closed his notepad. "Smart daughter." When Judge Holt called the court back to order, the gallery filled back in with the particular hush of people who understand they are about to hear something that will matter. The afternoon light had shifted, coming through the western windows at a lower angle, and it lay across the courtroom in long, flat bands that made everything look slightly more serious than usual, which was appropriate. Holt settled into his chair and looked at both tables, and then at the gallery with the face of a man who has made his decision and is about to say it with the full weight of 22 years on the bench behind every word. "I have sat in this court for a considerable length of time," he said. "I have heard cases involving property disputes, estate proceedings, questions of custody and welfare, and the conduct of officers of this court. I do not generally speak beyond my ruling. Today I am going to." The courtroom was absolutely still. The evidence presented in this proceeding establishes the following. He did not look at notes. First, the contract filed in connection with the Hale estate 14 months ago contains material alterations inconsistent with the original agreement as corroborated by multiple independent witnesses. The testimony of Isaac Greer, the documentary evidence in the notebook maintained by Nora Hale, and the correspondence entered by Mrs. Caswell collectively establish a pattern of deliberate manipulation of legal process for private financial gain. He paused. Second, the conduct of the respondent toward the minor child on August the 9th of this year constitutes child abandonment under Montana statute. The respondent's own testimony combined with the absence of any missing child report filed with law enforcement establishes that the abandonment was deliberate and premeditated. He looked at Dorothea Crane directly. She sat very still and did not look back. Third, the testimony of the minor child Nora Hale is consistent, corroborated on every material point by independent witnesses, and in my judgment entirely credible. I have been on this bench long enough to know the difference between a child who is performing a story and a child who is telling the truth. This child is telling the truth. He looked at Nora with the first expression he'd shown all day. That was something other than judicial neutrality, not quite warmth, but something adjacent to respect that sat in the particular way respect sits when it has been fully earned. Fourth, the correspondence entered into evidence documents an 11-year arrangement between the respondent's attorney and a sitting county magistrate that constitutes corruption of the judicial process. I am referring this matter to the State Attorney General's office and will be writing personally to the Judicial Review Board regarding Judge Harlan Pryor. Effective immediately, all proceedings originating from his court that have touched this case are void. Vane did not move. He sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at something that wasn't in the room. "The court finds for the plaintiff on all counts," Holt said. "Custody of Nora Hale is awarded to Caleb Harding of Harlan County, subject to the concurrent oversight of Abel Hale of Iowa as the legitimate named party in the original estate arrangement pending formal proceedings. The Hale land holdings are to be held in trust for Nora Hale until she reaches majority, with Abel Hale serving as trustee and George Aldridge as local counsel. He looked at Vane. "Mr. Vane, your license to practice law in the state of Montana is suspended pending investigation by the state bar. You will surrender your credentials to the clerk before leaving this building." Vane sat very still for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat, removed his bar credentials, and set them on the table in front of him, without speaking. Holt looked at the gallery, at the packed rows of people who had come from 2 counties to hear this. And then he said something none of them had been expecting. "I grew up without a father," he said. "I tell you that not for sympathy, but because it is relevant to what I am about to say. The law is a framework. It is not in itself justice. Justice requires the people within the framework to do something the law cannot legislate, to pay attention, to act when acting is costly, and to tell the truth when silence would be easier." He looked at Nora. "This court does not often have occasion to acknowledge that a 10-year-old child has demonstrated more of those qualities than most of the adults in any given proceeding. Today it does." He looked away. "Court is adjourned." The gavel came down. For 1 full second, nothing happened. Then the gallery broke like something that had been held back a long time and was done being held. Caleb heard none of it clearly. He was looking at Nora. She sat in her chair, and she did not stand with the crowd, and she did not turn to see who was moving or speaking around her. She sat with her hands flat on the table, and she looked at the place where Holt had been sitting, and her face held everything at once: exhaustion and relief and grief and something that had no clean name. The thing that happens when a weight carried so long it has become part of the body's normal is suddenly completely lifted. Caleb crouched down beside her chair. "Nora." She looked at him. "It's done," he said. Her throat moved. Her jaw set hard. "I know." "You did that," he said. "The notebook, the 13 miles, the witness stand, that was you." "We," she said. Her voice was thin but steady. "That was us." He looked at her for a moment. 10 years old. Wesley Hale's daughter. The best witness George Aldridge had put on a stand in 40 years. The girl who had pressed the truth flat against her chest for 14 months and walked 13 miles through August heat to find one honest man, and had been right about where to look. "Yeah," he said. "Us." She put her arms around his neck. She did it the way she did everything, decided, complete, without half measures. And Caleb Harding, who had not let himself hold on to anything in a long time, because holding on had cost him more than he'd known how to carry, held on. Abel Hale stood 3 feet away and looked at his brother's daughter and did not try to stop what moved across his face. Maggie, who had been sitting in the second row since 7:30 in the morning, pressed her hand to her mouth and looked at the ceiling. Dorothea Crane was led out a side door 15 minutes later, quiet in a way she had never been before. The composed widow finally and completely gone. Silas Vane handed his credentials to the court clerk without speaking, and walked out of the building and did not look back. Judge Harlan Pryor would receive a formal letter the following week and would not return to his bench. But all of that was later. Right now, there was only this: a man and a girl in a Copperfield courtroom, holding on in the middle of everything, while the room moved around them, and the afternoon light came through the western windows and lay across them both. The ride back to Harlan Creek took 2 hours. Caleb drove the wagon. Nora sat on the bench beside him, not in the back, not tucked away beside him, where the road stretched out ahead of them both. Abel rode behind them on his rented horse. Maggie sat in the wagon bed with her hands folded and her eyes closed, not sleeping, just resting in the particular way of a person who has been holding tension in their body for 6 days and is finally releasing it one muscle at a time. For the first mile, nobody said much of anything. Then Nora said, "What happens now?" "Aldridge files the formal custody paperwork next week," Caleb said. "Takes about 60 days for the court to process it fully. And my daddy's land. Abel takes over as trustee. He'll come out to Harlan Creek next month to go through everything with Aldridge. The land stays in your name. All of it. Every acre. He kept his eyes on the road. Your daddy made sure of that. Even from the beginning. Even when he was sick, he made sure of that. Nora turned that over in the careful way she turned everything over. He knew something might happen, she said. That's why he showed me the will. That's why he told me about you. He was building something in case he couldn't be there to finish it himself. Yes, Caleb said. He was. She looked at the road ahead. The trying compounds, she said quietly. That's what I think. One person tries and it doesn't pay off for them. But it keeps going. Through the people they leave behind, until it finally does. Caleb glanced at her. Your daddy teach you that? No, she said. I figured that one out myself. She paused. But I think he would have agreed. He thought about Wesley Hale, about a man who had fixed a stranger's wagon wheel and left his name and ridden away. About a man who had read 3 books until the spines gave out and tied them back together with string, because they were still worth reading. About a man who had taught his daughter a private language and shown her where the truth was kept, and told her the name of an honest man 2 counties north and hoped it would be enough. It had been enough. It had been more than enough. It had been everything. He would have, Caleb said. When they came through the gate at the Harding Ranch, Cobb was sitting on the fence post. He stood up when he saw the wagon coming and took his hat off and held it to his chest and didn't say a word. Caleb gave him a nod. Cobb put his hat back on and went back to his fence. Ada Fowler, who had known Wesley Hale for 20 years and had brought preserves to the gate on the second day and told Maggie she would be in that courtroom if it came to one, was on the porch. She had apparently spent the afternoon in Maggie's kitchen because she had decided that was what the situation required, and no one had told her otherwise. She came off the porch when Nora climbed down from the wagon, and she looked at the girl with the particular look of a woman who knew someone's father, and is now seeing that person in a face that carries both the father's features and something entirely its own. Wesley's girl, Ada said. Her voice was rough. Yes, ma'am. Ada opened her arms. Nora walked into them with the trust that only comes from a person who has run completely out of reasons to hold back. Ada held on, and over Nora's head she said to Caleb, "The county is talking. Pryor's finished. Vane's finished." She paused. "About time." "Yes, ma'am," Caleb said. "It is." Ada released Nora and held her by the shoulders and looked at her face. "You look like him around the eyes," she said. "People say that. Because it's true. Now come inside and eat something. You've been in a courtroom all day, and you look like you've been wrung out." "Yes, ma'am," Nora said, and she almost smiled, not quite, but closed the way a door moves when someone is on the other side deciding whether to open it. Supper was loud in a way the Harding Ranch had not been loud in years. Abel told a story about Wesley as a young man that made Maggie laugh so hard she had to set her fork down. Cobb ate 3 portions and offered occasional sounds of appreciation. Ada held forth on the state of Harlan County's judicial system with the comprehensive authority of a woman who had been paying attention for 60 years and had opinions about all of it. Aldridge sat at the corner of the table with a glass of water and the expression of a man who had done a good day's work and was allowing himself quietly and without announcement to know it. Caleb sat at his end of the table and watched all of it, and felt something he had not felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly, or not only happiness, but the sense of a house doing what a house is built to do. Holding people. Making room. Being more than 4 walls and a roof because of what was happening inside it. Nora sat across from Abel and asked him questions about Wesley's childhood. Not many questions, she was careful with them, the way a person is careful with something they know is limited. Abel answered each one with equal care, not rushing, not embellishing. Just telling the truth about a man he had loved for 50 years and lost without knowing it, and was still learning how to grieve. At some point, Abel said, "He used to collect rocks when we were boys, Interesting ones he'd find. Drove our mother half out of her mind. Nora looked up from her plate. "I do that," she said. Abel went still. Then he looked at her. Really looked. And something broke open in his face for the second time that day. And this time, he let it stay open. "I know," he said. "I saw them on the windowsill in your room. Maggie showed me around." He looked at his plate. "He mentioned it in a letter once. Said you'd started collecting rocks and sorting them by color and weight, and that you had a system he didn't fully understand, but that seemed to be working." His voice was careful and even. He was proud of everything you did. Every letter, something new. Something you'd figured out. Something you'd said. He stopped. "I knew you before I met you. I just didn't know I was losing you both at the same time." The table had gone quiet around them. Nora looked at Abel for a long moment. The measuring look, the careful assessment, and then something in her that had been held at a slight remove since he'd arrived, moved closer. "He was proud of you too," she said. "He said you were the most reliable person he knew. He said when the world made no sense, Abel Hale still made sense." Abel pressed his lips together hard. "He meant that as the highest compliment," Nora said. "I know he did." Abel looked at the table, then at her. "I'm going to make sure I deserve it." After supper, after Ada had gone home with her dishes, and Cobb had ambled back to the bunkhouse, and Abel had sat on the porch with Aldridge going through the details of the estate, Caleb found Nora in the kitchen. She was standing at the window with her notebook open on the table beside her, not reading it, just standing. The way a person stands near something they have kept close for a long time, and are beginning slowly to trust that it no longer needs to be kept quite so close. "You should sleep," Caleb said. "I know." She didn't move right away. "I was thinking about what Holt said, about the law being a framework, about justice requiring people to do things the law can't make them do." "What about it? My daddy believed that," she said. "He used to say that laws are just agreements, and agreements are only as good as the people who keep them." She looked at the notebook. "He kept his agreements, even when it cost him." She paused. "I think that's what killed him, actually. He wouldn't sign what Vane wanted him to sign. Not the real way, not willingly. So they found another way." Caleb was quiet. "But it also saved me," she said. "Because he kept his agreements with me too. He told me the truth. He gave me the tools. He said your name." She looked at Caleb. "So the same thing that got him killed is the thing that's keeping me safe." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were very bright. "I've been trying to figure out whether that's fair." "Is it?" Caleb said. She thought about it for a real moment. "No," she said, "but it's true. And I think maybe that's what my daddy meant when he said truth was more important than fair. Fair is what we want. Truth is what we have to work with." She closed the notebook and picked it up. "I can work with this." He looked at her. This girl who had walked 13 miles on principle, who had sat across from a hostile lawyer at 10 years old and held every question he threw at her like she'd been born for exactly that. Who had built a chain of evidence in a private language and carried it against her chest for 14 months because her father had taught her that the truth was the only thing nobody could take. "Yeah," he said. "You can." She tucked the notebook under her arm. Then she looked at him with those brown eyes that had been measuring and deciding since the first moment she'd turned to face him on that trail. Caleb. It was the first time she'd used his name without the Mr. She said it carefully, the way she'd been working up to it, the way she'd been working up to most things, deciding first, then doing it completely. "Yeah," he said. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she said, "Thank you for stopping." He thought about the trail, about the particular quality of the light that morning, and the way she'd been standing perfectly still in the middle of it. About how close he'd come to telling himself it wasn't his business and riding on. "Thank you for still being there when I did," he said. She nodded once, the nod of someone receiving something they needed and intend to keep. Then she went down the hall. He heard her door. He heard the quiet that followed. He stood in the kitchen for a while and listened to the house breathe around him. Abel's voice low on the porch, the sound of Maggie banking the stove in the back room, the horses in the stable shifting and settling, the specific living sounds of a place that had too much silence in it for too long and was finally deliberately filling back up. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from the Montana State Attorney General's office, confirming formal charges filed against Dorothea Crane, Silas Vane, and 2 associates for estate fraud, document forgery, and criminal endangerment of a child. Judge Harlan Pryor had surrendered his bench and was under review. The Harlan Creek Savings Bank had new management. And the Hale land, 460 acres of southeastern Montana that Wesley Hale had built with his hands and his word and his whole good life, was legally and permanently secured in trust for Nora Hale until she came of age. Caleb read the letter at the kitchen table and handed it to Nora without comment. She read it slowly, folded it, set it down. "Is it enough?" she asked. Not of Caleb, not really of anyone. Of the heir, maybe. Of her father, maybe. Caleb looked at her. "No," he said. "It isn't enough. It won't ever be enough." She looked at him. "But it's something," he said. "And something is what we had to work with." She nodded. She picked up the letter and folded it again and carried it to her room, where she put it in the box she kept under the bed. The box that held the notebook and 3 letters from Abel and a small flat river rock she'd found on the walk back from the gate the morning after the hearing, smooth and gray-green and satisfying in the hand, the first rock she'd added to her collection since the night she'd left everything behind and walked 13 miles toward the only name she trusted. The formal adoption was granted on a Tuesday in November in the same Copperfield courtroom before the same Judge Holt. The gallery was smaller this time. No crowd, no spectacle. Just Aldridge Abel, Maggie, Ada Fowler, Cobb, in a clean shirt that was slightly too large. Ruth Caswell in the back row, who had come without being asked and sat without calling attention to herself, and Isaac Greer, who had driven 40 miles because Nora had asked him to, and that had been sufficient reason. Caleb signed the papers at the table. Aldridge witnessed them. Holt reviewed each page. Then he looked up. "Mr. Harding, for the record, do you freely and voluntarily choose to assume permanent legal parental responsibility for Nora Hale with full understanding of the rights and obligations and permanence thereof?" Caleb looked at Nora sitting beside him with her hands folded on the table, watching him with those brown eyes that had decided about him on a dusty trail in August before he'd said more than 30 words to her because her father had told her he was worth deciding about, and she had trusted that above everything else. "I already did," he said. Aldridge smiled. Maggie made a sound she would later deny. Cobb examined the ceiling. Abel Hale pressed his lips together and nodded once, the nod of a man paying a debt he owed to his brother across whatever distance separated the living from the dead. Holt stamped the document. "The adoption of Nora Hale is granted and recorded by the state of Montana as of this date." He looked at them both. "Congratulations." Nora looked at the paper in front of her. Her name on it, the old and the new together, Hale written in the legal recitation, and Harding written at the end of it, clean and permanent and chosen. She touched it once with one finger lightly to be certain it was real. "Harding," she said. Quiet, trying the weight of it. "You don't have to take it," Caleb said. "You can keep Hale. It's legal either way." She thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. "Harding," she said again. Decided. "Nora Hale Harding." She looked at him. "Both. I want both." "Both it is," Aldridge said, already writing. The first hard rain of November came that evening, steady and cold and long-awaited, the kind that meant the dry season was genuinely finished, and the land could stop holding its breath. It drummed on the roof of the Harding Ranch, and ran off the eaves in clean sheets and turned the yard to dark mud and smelled like everything that had been waiting a long time to come back. Nora went outside and stood in it. Not because she didn't know it was raining, because she did, and she wanted to be in it, and there was no longer any reason not to be exactly where she wanted to be. She stood in the yard, with her face up and her eyes closed, and the rain coming down on her, the way rain comes down on everything, without conditions, without history, without asking what you've been through or what you've lost, or whether you deserve the relief of it. Just falling clean and indifferent and generous on everything it touched. Caleb stood on the porch and watched her. She lowered her face after a while and opened her eyes and looked at the yard. Really looked the way she looked at everything completely without reservation. Then she turned and looked at him on the porch. He raised one hand. Simple, small. Just, I see you. Just, I'm here. She raised her hand back. Then she turned to face the open land again, with her arms slightly out from her sides, and her palms open, standing free in the particular way that only belongs to people who have earned it at a cost. Most people will never be asked to pay. Who have carried the truth across 13 miles of August heat and 14 months of silence and one courtroom in Copperfield, Montana, and have come out the other side of all of it, still standing still, whole, still exactly and entirely themselves. Caleb Harding watched Wesley Hale's daughter stand in the first November rain and felt something complete itself in him that had been incomplete for a long time. Not loss, erased, not grief undone, but the particular fullness that comes when a life kept narrow and manageable and safe from caring too much opens back up and lets someone in. He had not gone looking for this. He had almost ridden past it. But he had stopped, and she had chosen him and the chain Wesley Hale had built with his life, with every agreement kept, and every truth told, and every rock collected, and every letter written, and one quiet conversation with a daughter who was going to need a name to walk toward someday. That chain had held all the way to the end. That evening, Nora came in from the rain and stood dripping on Maggie's clean floor, without apology, and sat down at the kitchen table. Caleb poured 2 cups of cider, one for each of them, and sat across from her. She wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at him with those eyes that had seen more than any 10-year-old should have seen and had kept seeing anyway. She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. "Dad," she said. One word, careful and deliberate, and everything she'd been working toward since the morning she climbed down from his horse and stood in this yard and decided that trust was not the same as risk, and that the right man, the one her father had named on purpose, with love and foresight, and the full weight of everything he knew, was worth the reach. Caleb went very still. He looked at her. He did not try to smooth out his voice when he spoke. "Yeah," he said. "That's right." She nodded once, like something had been confirmed that she had already known. Then she drank her cider, and the rain came down on the roof of the Harding Ranch, and outside the land, drank what it had been needing for a long time, and inside the kitchen, a man who had nearly ridden past the most important moment of his life, and a girl who had walked 13 miles to make sure he didn't sat across from each other in the warm and the light, and neither of them needed to say anything else. Some things cannot be forged. Some things cannot be stolen or abandoned on a road in August, or buried in an estate filing, or silenced by the kind of power that mistakes fear for permanence. Some things chosen freely held through fire, built one honest decision at a time, by a man who knew he might not be there to see them through, are simply permanent. This was one of them.